Ben. Hi, I'm Ben. I'm with the Helena Citizens Council.
I'm Diana Hammer. I'm with the Helena Citizens Council also.
And Patricia Bick, also with the Helena Citizens Council.
Well, good to meet you all. I'm Cliff Strachan, obviously candidate for city manager.
Thank you. We have guests from the media.
I'm Ryan Berg from MTN News.
And City Clerk today, Claire Barnes is running all the technicalities over there. So we do want this to be a kind of an informal interaction. You know, we've got the 4 questions and we've got about 45 minutes. We probably want to wrap up a little bit before the program for one. So maybe we'll shoot for like 105 or so as far as the wrap up time. So that should give us about 35 minutes.
Okay.
For the conversation. Ben and Patricia will be asking the questions. So without further ado, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
Please
go with the first one. Well, and we'll be asking all the candidates the same questions. Meaningful community engagement and access to city staff are important to a well-informed and well-functioning city. In Helena, we have the Helena Citizens Council established by the city charter, which is composed of 28 elected representatives from 7 neighborhood districts. The HCC makes recommendations to the city on budget and future development of the city. In addition, the city has several advisory boards, for example, parks, open lands, water quality, conservation, public art, etc. And those advisory boards provide community input and make recommendations to the city commission. So this is a 3-part question. What approach or approaches of meaningful and effective community engagement have you initiated, supported, and been involved in? And then I'll ask the other 2 after this.
Well, to break it up a little bit. Well, I have to admit, this is the first time I've ever had a TV camera and the media in an interview, so it's a new experience. I'm really glad to be here. I will tell you that my approach to community engagement starts with I support it. I think one of the roles of our civic governments is to be open and transparent, and I think it's always been an important part of the job I've done is to try and be accessible to the press and accessible to the community the best I can. In terms of the best experience I've had with community engagement, I would put for my time with the Provo City Council, going back 6-7 years now, until last year. Provo actually had, when I got there, Provo had some civic engagement. They have a neighborhood program, somewhat different than yours, but they had, there was some room for improvement and a way of stepping it up. And so we did that. When I got there, they were very active with social media, the Instagram, the Facebook, the Twitter, all those normal ones. We had our own blog. We also had, used our website extensively to not only publish meetings and things like that, but to use it for promoting the things that the council was doing. One of the things that I came across was a program called Open Town Hall. We redubbed it Open City Hall for our city, and we implemented that in our community. Initially, we started it with the idea that we would just put the occasional question out to the public and ask them to engage. By the time I was done with my time there, because of COVID, we actually moved a lot of our land use items onto there. Partly because the way our neighborhood program worked, that very often when there was a land use issue, it would come and we'd have a neighborhood chair from that neighborhood come and comment, but not necessarily a lot of other people. So we did that as a way of expanding the engagement. And I'll tell you that over time, that tool became a really good tool for us. The first few topics we put out there didn't get a lot of engagement. We had to, educate people that it was out there, how to use it. We found that it was important to have distinguish between registered users and non-registered users, because you can game the system if you're non-registered, by getting other people who may be biased in one way to push on it. But we learned some things about it. We created policies around it. One of the things that two of the projects that we put out there, questions we put out to the community that garnered the most feedback was one for a conservative LDS town like Provo was whether or not we would have brew pubs in the community. That got us thousands of comments. And the other was during COVID with the mask. The council had wanted a mask requirement in the city. The mayor didn't, so it was very controversial. So we put stuff out like that. So those are some of the things that we've done. The other thing I thought was important, and I started this early in my career, it's been good to know the people in the press and have a good relationship with them, let them know, that you're there to answer questions and can help them. It creates a kind of a good bond. When I got to Provo in 2016, one of the council members, the chair at the time, had said to me, "Look, I'm concerned that we don't seem to get good press from our local paper. The mayor does. The mayor had a really top-notch press push going and had a really good relationship." So I started meeting regularly with the council chair and myself. We would meet every week or two with the local reporter. And we talked about our agenda, talked about the things that we were dealing with. And it came out to be where we started getting really favorable press coverage on the things that the council was doing. And part of that was not that what we were doing was so much better than the previous council had done. It was that the local reporter now knew what we were doing and being able to get the council's viewpoints on it. So that was really helpful. We do in Provo have a neighborhood program. There were some challenges with it that we were trying to fix over time. But using the neighborhood program to have neighborhood meetings and reach out on various issues was important to us. And then the other thing we like to do, depend on the committee and the type of thing we were doing, but we create a committee structure sometimes where we have members of the public, whether it be a neighborhood chair or somebody who's interested from a certain community, and we'd have them come and participate on various committees that we had. And one in particular that was, I think, rather successful is what we called our West Side Planning Committee. And we were in Provo, the I-15 runs right down the middle of, almost say the middle of town, because Center Street's to the east, but it runs down between the west side of our community and the city. So the city is captured on one side, on the east side by the mountains, and on the west side by a lake, and it's got the I-15 running through it. The west side, which was very much rural for generations, development was more and more creeping into that area. And so we had to come up with some issues, the planning on that area. And so the way to do that was we brought in people from that part of the community. We brought people from the other part of the community because we felt they still had a right to have some say. So we created a really neat committee that ran about 6 or 8 months and came back with some recommendations for the planning commission to work with. So we did stuff like that.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm sorry, I was Lowell calling. I don't know if you're having problems getting in. So
would you like to address that in what you did?
well, maybe just I'll do it after this question. Another important aspect of community engagement is having access to city staff. How would you manage access to city staff for the public?
Yeah, for the public or for the commission, or for the council?
I guess we didn't really specify. I was thinking for the public, and
For the public and the Helena Citizens Council members
Yeah,
accessing.
oh yes, I'm sorry.
City
That's
staff and
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I'm sorry. It would be the Citizens Council and the Citizens Advisory Boards.
okay.
Mhm.
So that area, not Joe, regular citizen
yeah.
voter. Okay, so generally, I'm supportive of that communication and that interaction. The challenge that I've seen is it works until it doesn't. And so usually what I've found is if you have someone who is overly aggressive in terms of their questions or their time needs or whatever, it becomes a burden to the employee. That's where we end up having to push back. But I found that over the years that generally the interaction between staff and commissioners, staff and the neighborhood program staff and even residents sometimes has been very, very helpful. And because a lot of times the professional staff, for example, if you have a question on some engineering thing that's, beyond, I'm not an engineer, but if you have a question on an engineering thing that I can't necessarily explain to you in a way that's helpful, the engineer can. But if you come in and you pepper that engineer day after day after day with questions, that becomes a problem. And so I've seen both extremes, but generally I'm favorable as long as the relationship isn't impeding the employee's ability, the director's ability, or mine, or whoever's ability to perform their work. So it's a bit of a balancing act. I have seen it where we've had to restrict access to certain people because of abuse of that. But generally I'm favorable as long as it's a respectful and put in both ways.
Thank you. And then the last part, how would you work with the city commission to respond to and, as appropriate, implement citizen council and advisory board recommendation?
Sure. Well, I think it's, I'm not knowing exactly the intricacies of how your advisory boards work. A lot of the boards that I've worked with in the past have usually had staff support. And so in many cases, staff knows what's coming. I've been very good at making sure our communities are communicating with, I've gone back and forth between commission and councils because mine have all been councils. But generally what I've tried to do is have our committees report directly to the councils, whether it's just in the terms of here's the notes from our meeting or the minutes from our meeting, so everybody has access to them. But staff tends to know. But I think what happens is when you have these reports and recommendations, they need to be moved to the people who need to receive them. And so if your advisory board makes a report, I would expect to deliver it to the commission and have them consider it. Now, whether it gets implemented is going to depend on things like resources, right? Do we have the human and the financial and the political will to actually move forward on those recommendations? And I think that's a reasonable way to address them. And then of course there's that whole issue of volume, right? If you can have a body that generates 30 or recommendations in a year, if staff doesn't have the ability to manage that workload, we can't do it. But I think the advisory boards are there. The commission is the Citizens Commission and other bodies that you create are there for a reason, and that book needs to be moved through to the extent that it can.
Okay, thank you very much.
For the second question, as with most attractive towns in the Intermountain West, Helena faces critical challenges in housing, affordability, and availability. What is your experience in fostering city-supported affordable housing development, annexations of adjacent areas in the county, and the creation and implementation of measures related to encouraging infill?
Sure. I never had an annexation go through, but my time in Provo, we were considering one, and then it was withdrawn, so we didn't have to go through that. But state law in Utah basically dictates how it's going to happen, and so it becomes ultimately you're not fighting two different jurisdictions for the same area. It's clear who's going to get it if they want it, and then you just vote on it. So there's a report system that we do to evaluate the costs, et cetera, to do that. In Utah right now, it's interesting the question you asked, because in some jurisdictions and they're asking a little bit different. They're saying, hey, the legislature is telling us we have to do this, but we don't want to. In Utah, that's actually the case. The legislature says we want you to have accessory dwelling units. We want you to increase the minimum number or the maximum number of people you can put in a rental unit. They want to open up things and take some of that power away from the cities. So it's become a battle between local governments and the state government in many cases. And the challenge we have when I was in Provo, one of the challenges that we had was Provo's a university town. Brigham Young University is there. Less than 8 miles away across in the neighboring city is another university that has 40,000 students. And so there are 70,000 students there, call it 50,000 that are not living at home or whatever, right? But who actually are trying to live in these communities, and it's overwhelming for them. So one of the challenges we were trying to deal with was we already have 60% of our population is rental. we were resisting the encroachment into homes because we were having an investment class come in and buy up our houses, and then because they could rent them out, or you could rent it out to a family for say $2,000, you could rent it out for $4,000 to get enough people. That was becoming a challenge. So we were resisting some of that. But what we were trying to do was we did recognize, look, we have a population that need affordable housing. And so we were trying to deal with that. So we were working with groups like the Food and Care Coalition where there's changes to our standards, like impact fees that we could make to make costs lower for them. Provo has its own housing authority that works with low income folks to help put them in housing. So there's lots of affordable housing in that community. We were trying to do that. We were also exploring an idea with different charities to try and create a community land trust where we put a property into this trust and then have an opportunity for people to buy a property, but cap what they take out of it when they move on. Because wealth creation comes from home ownership. And it's one of the ways, but it's one of the better ways to do it is to do that. So we were trying to find ways to encourage that. So I've been fortunate to be in a city like that was trying to find ways, even as we were dealing with the challenge of having 60% rentals and 60% of the rental housing in the county. So those were challenges that we were dealing with. In other cities I've been at prior to this crisis that we've been dealing with, honestly, the effort from the cities was often resistant to having any rentals, and it actually took the 2008, 2009 Great Recession to move a lot of cities in Salt Lake County to having more rental units, because that's what developers started coming back with instead of just single family housing on 38 blocks. So.
And I just want to make one interruption. Lowell, I believe one of our other HCC members has joined us. Lowell, are you with us?
Yep, I am.
No, he
Hello,
was having
Mr.
problems
Strachan.
getting on, and he just texted. I think he's just going to come down here
He's
for the
on his
other
way.
interviews.
Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Yeah, Danae
Well-
just told me that he was online. So
Can you hear me?
Oh.
Can you not hear me?
Oh,
I don't know.
the text, let's see, there's enough time. I just assumed he was driving here now
Okay,
and,
I see him on here.
okay.
oh, you do?
His microphone must not be working.
Maybe
So.
he needs to be.
Oh, good.
That's great. Thanks.
We did talk about infill development, which is a problem for a lot of places. The challenge I think cities have is that very often we recognize that we have this need for infill or more rentals or whatever. But every city, I think, suffers from the NIMBY issue of, great to have it, but I don't want it in my neighborhood. When Provo started changing some of its, because of the mandate to change some of its ADUs, we got some exceptions from the state, but we still had to put it in allow it in about 25% of neighborhoods. And it came down to is we get people down at the meeting saying, "Oh, I'm all for that, but not my neighborhood." Right. So we have that challenge that we try to do it. And so I think the challenge with things like infill is we have to work together with our neighborhoods and our community to figure out what are the standards we're going to allow for that infill and where is the appropriate place to do it. We certainly don't want what's happening in California, where some cities have kind of opened the door and you can find 2 or 3 units of extra housing behind someone's main house. I don't think we want to do that. So.
Okay.
Can we ask Lowell to speak again?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Lowell, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Okay, I think we'll just go ahead and. You wanna
Okay.
ask the question?
Yeah, all these technological.
The mic
challenges.
is not working. He's on. Mhm.
So the third question, similar to many cities throughout the country, the city of Helena has budget constraints that limit the city's ability to implement long needed infrastructure upgrades and community development goals. So please describe your experience in developing creative fee assessments that will produce reliable revenue streams and your experience in leveraging grant dollars that will augment those revenue streams.
Sure. I was interested in the idea of a creative fee, right? Not sure what you're allowed to do here in Montana versus say what every other jurisdiction I've been in. So I think there's ways of finding things as long as it's lawful. The challenge, I think, that most governments and certainly every government I've worked with is that they don't necessarily use the fee permissions that they've got now to the full extent. And I'll give you some examples. I'm not saying I'm pro this or pro that, but what I'm saying is that sometimes we have the tools and we don't use them to the maximum capacity. For example, years ago, for decades in Utah, the common theme was we don't want to raise property taxes because it's going to affect the elderly, it's going to affect this or that or the other thing, but we didn't want to raise property taxes. So we relied on new revenues, we relied on building fees, we relied on things like sales taxes to generate what cities could provide. In Provo City, one of the things we did, and I'll tell about another aspect there that will kind of discount that, but one of the things we looked at was we said to council, we are in Utah, if your city raises $1 million this year in property tax, that no matter other than new development, that you can only raise $1 million next year based on. So you can get new growth from new development, but you can't get it from the old stuff. So if you, unless you raise the rate, your $1 million is going to be $1 million next year too. So what we showed the council was that because of the reluctance over decades of not doing it was there's a big gap between what you could have done if you just kept the mill rate the same and get to a certain point, because even though houses went from say $100,000 to $600,000 over a period of time, you're still only getting this much money out of that house for taxes. I mean, relative to variations around there, but the point was that there's a huge gap, and our council started recognizing, hey, there's millions of dollars that we haven't collected that we could have used for our sewers, we could have used for roads, we could have used for parks and programs that we haven't done. Similarly, the same thing with utility taxes and fees, and it was funny because when I got to Provo, the council was asking us for they're actually asking the administration for regular fee reviews. They wanted a bunch of fees every 3 or 4 months to review. And it happened a couple of times, but it was onerous for them. So I got myself an intern and we came in and we started picking departments and started looking at their fees. And one of the things we looked at, so I for example, I'm working on the engineering fees. And so we're doing a comparison. We call up the neighboring cities and we said, well, how did you set your fees? Oh, we called around and we took yours. Right. And so very often what was happening was that people would call around, see what everybody else was, in other words, the market rate, and just charging them. And what we were able to do is show the council that, look, you're charging fees for this and this and this, and you're collecting this, you're charging this much, but your cost is actually here. And I say to the council all the time, I don't care what you charge, but you just need to know that you're subsidizing with the general fund. Right, or from property sales taxes or whatever. You're subsidizing a service that we're providing to some residents without having the appropriate fee for it. If you want to do that, that's great. That's a policy decision, but we're just going to make sure you have the facts. So that was always very helpful to do it that way. That's just one example. One of the things we were looking at in Sandy City, they had to have some significant infrastructure needs. They need new buildings for parks and rec, for a recreation center, for a fire station, for the public works facility, and some others. And one of the things that they had done was they had a small area that they were going back about 40 years. They had a recreation center that was funded with a special services assessment, and we were trying to figure out what to do with that. The reason I mentioned that was it's recognition sometimes that we can come in and say, hey, we're going to build this program. And we talked about this, we're going to facility. And once it's paid off, we'll do a special assessment to fund this. Once it's paid off, it goes away. Unless you wanted to also use it to fund for ongoing expenses going on. So those are some of the discussions that we have. But there's so many ways to look at the fees and whether or not you bring in, what is it, you have a joint with the county. No,
Oh, interlocal agreement.
yes, with the local agreement. No, I was thinking that, you have an arrangement with the landfill and to give a private partner to that, right? But you can look at private public partnerships to do some of those fees and raising them. Early in my career, there were a number of cities in British Columbia that had worked with some developers. I think it was Parksville City is the one I remember the most. But they'd gone out with a developer and said, "Hey, we need a new city hall." So they built a city hall. They built a kind of new downtown. I can't remember what direction it is that you have your really new downtown from a number of years ago. But that way, I'm a little turned around. What they did was they built a development in there. They provided a little bit more retail space. They built them a city hall. They basically said, "You're going to lease it now for the next 20 years. At the end of 20 years, for $1 you can have." Right. So there are ways to find funding using the private sector as well. So I'm open to exploring all sorts of ideas if there's the will to do it.
Could you talk a little bit about the grant, looking for grant money to augment those kind of fees?
Yeah, I have done some grants. I haven't had a lot of success in them because it hasn't been the primary part of my role. But the State Transportation Improvement Program grants, for example, from federal highway funds in Utah, back about 2005 to 8, there was a real effort to beautify the interstates. And so I wrote, with our engineers, I wrote a grant for the STIP funding from the state to improve our side of the I-15. Sandy City on the other side would have to do theirs. And I wrote it. We did that through the process. We didn't actually get anything that first year, and then I left and went somewhere else. But the next year, they just submitted basically the updated version of the same grant and got the money. Sandy got it, and so both sides of the intersection were done. So that was one example. Another was in a place called Stewart, British Columbia. Many years ago, I was in an intern situation. They brought me up. It's hundreds of miles north of the border. It's on the south end of the Alaska Panhandle on the Canadian side. And I wrote a grant there where we funded some boardwalk as a job creation, as a recession. So we as a job creation effort to bring in funding just to make some jobs. But my sister was up there last summer and they were up there and said, "Oh, there's this great boardwalk." I said, "Yeah, I got the money for that." But that was kind of fun. And then the last one I would tell you about is just skip my mind here. Yeah, just skip my mind. I had a project. I just lost it on me. Sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
And finally, the city of Helena has multiple resolutions centered on citywide sustainability, neighborhood livability, and climate action goals, including a resolution calling for 100% clean and renewable electricity for the Helena community by 2030. The resolution on climate change with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions of the city and increasing the climate resilience of public works system, and a resolution on waste reduction. In your role as city manager, how will you advance and prioritize the implementation of the city's resolutions and other sustainability efforts?
Sure. It's good. It's a very good question. I think at the end of the day, well, where I start really is it's opposite end of the day, but where I start is understanding what they are, what it means, determining what resources we have, because everything always comes back to resources, right? And where's the political will, both in terms of the elected officials and even in the community? Do we really want this? And implementing them to the degree we can. The ability of, say, our city council in Provo and other places, your ability to pass resolutions far exceeds our ability to implement them. So you have to find that balance: is what is the most important, and how we're going to accomplish them, and do we have the resources to do it? But my role is to do my best to help us move in those. And then the other part of that is in terms of prioritization. It's okay to say, hey, we want sustainability, but what are the steps are we going to take to get there? When I was in earlier in my career, one of the places I was in, we had a vision statement, and there was a whole bunch of targets that we were trying to accomplish, and really came down to which of these are most important. And then the other thing is with all that is if you're not measuring what you're trying to implement, you don't know where you are and how you're going to get there. So I think it's important to prioritize those in terms of figuring out what is how are we going to get there, and then what is the will, and the will is reflected in the resources that the community is given or set aside. Because at the end of the day, we're not given anything. We're using resources provided by our taxpayers. So.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty much concludes the interview phase. We do have, I'd say probably about 5 minutes just for some informal interaction. If anybody has any questions, I don't know if we were able to get Lowell hooked up or not. If you had anything you wanted to add or say.
Is he able to speak? I think he's able to listen.
Hail Mary here. Well,
Can you hear me?
Can
you hear
Yeah.
me?
Yes, thank you, Lowell.
Excellent. Well, yeah, my apologies for not being there in person. I've had RSV run through my household, so I figured it was best to stay away. But thank you, Mr. Strachan. Am I saying that correctly?
Strachan.
Strachan. Yeah, thank you for the answers. It was really good to hear from you. And I guess I would just have one follow-up on the fee assessment question and grants. As I understand, our city department only really has one person dedicated to exploring grant opportunities. And in your experience with other cities, is there generally a grant department that's staffed by 3 to 5 people? And is that something you would be interested in pursuing? Because like you said, all these initiatives, it all comes down to the money and whether we have the money to implement these resolutions. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on exploring or building a grant department within the city.
Yeah, in my experience, especially the smaller communities, there haven't been grants departments for certain. Very often you might be lucky to have one main grants person kind of coordinating them. A lot of the cities I've been in tend to have someone who has written grants for, say, public safety, and they're very good. They're very focused on that. You might have an engineering team where you have somebody who writes grants for the highways funds and things like that. But even in the bigger places I haven't seen even I'm trying to think if there's any biggest ones. I can't think. Provo didn't have one. Sandy didn't have one. Where we have a dedicated person that coordinates all the grants. And usually what happens is fire department will write grants and get some money, and then it'll just go through a process of appropriation, and somebody in finance tracks them. And that's about as far as it's gone. But having, if there are sufficient grants, it would be certainly worth either employing someone who professionally writes grants as a contractor, or having someone who could kind of lead the way within the organization, because some grants are really challenging to put together, and it is time impactful.
Yeah, thank you for that.
All right, well, I think that concludes our reception phase. We'll, like I said, we have a couple minutes for some informal action, and then we'll give our committee a little break before their next interview.
Certainly.
And we'll see you this afternoon.
Thank you. Appreciate everybody.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lowell. Hopefully I get to meet you some other time.
Yeah, for sure. Nice to meet you on Zoom.
But this is